Good evening, welcome to Central News for Wednesday 31st of July. I'm Amy Forrest. In today's news, the Armistice Society of Cambridge wants to celebrate the centenary of World War I next year with a replica trench system at Lake Karapero's Mighty River Domain. They are hoping it will be used as an educational tool by surrounding schools to learn about the reality of trench warfare suffered by the New Zealand soldiers in Gallipoli and on the Western Front in 1915 to 1918. The Anzac Sector trench replica will also be used for history tours and enactments of World War I, where New Zealand suffered the biggest loss of life per population than any other country involved. Chairman of the Armistice in Cambridge, Rob Feast, says the project will cost $200,000 and the resource consent process is just the beginning.
We have a major project organised at this stage in conjunction with the community for 2018, which will coincide with the centennial of the liberation of Le Quesnoy, which was the week before the end of World War I. And that last week, we're going to make it a continual celebration, commemoration, call it what you like, through the town and the local community.
Hundreds of protesters took to the streets of Tauranga yesterday to march against the testing of party pills on animals. The Tauranga March from the Strand is part of a nationwide campaign in protest of the Psychoactive Substances Bill aiming to regulate the sale of party pills and synthetic cannabis. The bill was passed in Parliament this month, requiring manufacturers to prove their products are safe for use. It bans a number of synthetic highs and party pills from shelves. An amendment on animal testing has since been added, but a total ban on animal testing as part of the legislation was voted down in Parliament on July 10th. Associate Health Minister Todd McClay today welcomed the protests that raise concerns about the possibility of animal testing for psychoactive products. Yesterday's protest in Tauranga was one of 11 centres around the country holding protests. Now for our region's weather. Hamilton, your Thursday is becoming cloudy with a high of 15 and a low of 9. And Tauranga, some showers for you with a high of 16 and a low of 10. Just ahead, an update on Project 270 helping those in poverty in the Waikato. Welcome to Central News on TV Central. Project 270 has helped many homes in Hamilton become warmer this winter. Hilary Entwistle went along to find out more.
Project 270 is a project which focuses on child poverty. And the reason it's called 270 is because there's over 270,000 children in Aotearoa, New Zealand that live below the poverty line. A lot of them are Māori, but they actually come from a full range of ethnic roots. And basically it was our way of actually putting a spotlight on the issue by calling it Project 270, so it's a bit of a play on words. And basically it's our attempt, if you like, as a Māori Health Unit to try and reduce down or eliminate or mitigate the effects of poverty, child poverty. We're doing that through three key components. The first is to offer, free home insulation, both for ceilings and floors. And that makes the home a lot more warmer, a lot more drier, and that's conducive to good health outcomes. There's a lot of poor families actually live in cold and damp homes. And the second part is also to provide food in schools for children who are actually hungry. And I think the third part of that was also is just to look at, GP services or nursing services in primary schools and making sure that they are actually working in the low income schools, because that's where the high need is. And if you're looking at prioritising where the need is, you go to the low-income areas because they have a high health need.
Where are you up to then in your insulation initiative?
Well, basically the first phase of the project, which ran over the last 12 months, is actually wound up. And we managed over that period to get 1,000 referrals through for high needs families to have their homes insulated. And at the business end, we got about 380, so close to 400 homes insulated for free. And that's been quite good. We're simply waiting for the insulation companies to determine whether they've got additional funding for the next 12 months, and that funding will come from ECA, so the Energy Conservation authority associated with the government. And if they have the funding, the installation companies will, in conjunction with us, open the program again.
What are the conditions? I mean, do you have to own the home?
No, you don't. There are some conditions, however. You can own the home, you could rent the home. The home can't be a Housing New Zealand home because Housing New Zealand has its own installation project. You basically have to be living within Hamilton or 30 k's out from Hamilton, so it was a Hamilton-based initiative. And you'd have to have children living in the home that are 16 years or under, and you have to have a community services card, so it's targeted at high needs families, low income families.
Who is funding the initiative?
It is primarily through ECA, which is a part of the government, and that's a company that, or part of the government rather, that actually focuses on making sure that we use energy in an efficient way. And part of that is insulation of homes, and it has a direct positive health benefit to people living in that home if it's warmer and drier. So ECA partly funds it, and then insulation companies also seek third-party funding, additional funding, and that may come from a variety of different sources. Once they have that funding, they have the ability to insulate homes both on the floor and the ceiling for free if people meet those criteria.
What are the conditions that some of these families live in?
Oh, I think we've got huge problems in terms of poverty in the Waikato, and certainly if you're poor, you often live in substandard housing. There's lots of definitions of what poverty constitutes. Some people say, you know, you're earning 60% or less of the mean income, but generally what it means is that you don't own your own home quite often. The home that you live in is substandard, the windows are cracked, it's cold, it's wet, you probably don't have enough money to pay for food or cover basic necessities, and you'll be in a household which is tense because money is an issue.
How are they heating their homes, I mean, if they can afford to?
Well, I guess people heat their homes in lots of different ways. A lot of it's to do with what's already in the home. One of the things which can be concerning is some of the heating devices that people use aren't conducive to good health. And we even have heard of instances where people actually use the warmth of the stove to actually heat their home. Or people often just don't have heating, and they live in a very cold environment.
How is the Food in Schools initiative going?
It's going really well. The funding that we've secured as a Māori Health Unit's enabled the Kids Can Food in Schools initiative basically to be extended out to 23 primary schools, which are decile 1 and 2 across the Greater Waikato, so that's great. Those children are getting regular meals through that initiative, so that's fantastic. But as good as it is, we know that there's a much larger need out there that's unmet, so we'll continue to try and secure funding to extend that program through to other schools as well.
Do you think that the boost from the government and Fonterra has actually made a difference?
Oh yeah, without question. I think that's a fantastic initiative, but it's largely focused on breakfast, you know, wheat bits and milk. So you know, the Kids Can initiative will take care of lunch as well, and perhaps morning or afternoon tea. And if you think about it, that's logical. You and I probably couldn't function normally if we just had breakfast. You know, to actually have meals throughout the day is important. And I know there's a lot of debate as to whether it's right to do that or not. Some people think it's a state responsibility. Some people think that it's a individual parent's responsibility. But whoever's responsibility is, it isn't the responsibility of children, and they don't choose to be hungry. So it's a great initiative.
Have you noticed a difference in those children that are going to school with full bellies and a good warm night's sleep?
Yeah, absolutely. The feedback's been really positive, and I mean, I think one of the things that the teachers actually say is that the kids are able to concentrate at school because they're not starving, and therefore they can hopefully learn a lot better.
Coming up next, more fish in the sea at Makatu. Welcome back. The Kaituna River was re-diverted back in 1956, which impacted hugely on the wetlands and the kaimoana of the estuary at Makatu. The Bay of Plenty Regional Council will be making some big changes to try to restore the environment.
Who is involved with the Kaituna River and the o ngā toro Maketu Estuary Strategy?
Well, first of all, the community. The strategy is part of a long-running effort by the community to restore the river and the estuarine system around Maketu. But the strategy itself arose when the Regional Council applied to itself for resource consent for the Ohau Channel in Lake Rotoiti, I think in 2006. And so there was a joint council committee formed, which is a local government initiative that involves several councils, and they heard submissions from the community and then prepared the strategy, which was released in 2009. So it was led by the Regional Council, but it involved other councils and interested parties such as the Department of Conservation and Fish and Game, and of course Tangata Whenua and other stakeholders.
The council wants to divert the river's outlets. So what has been happening since 1956 that has had such a bad environmental impact?
Well, it's a long story, but I'm happy to give you the potted summary, Hilary. In 1956, the estuary was mostly a freshwater system, so it had 3 parts river water to 1 part salt water. If you imagine 3 parts coming in from the river, 1 part coming in past the surf club. When Te Tumu Cut was constructed in 1956, that changed. So what happened was almost all of the river then went straight out to sea at Te Tumu, which meant that the estuary had to fill up from the sea. So the salinity, the saltiness of the estuary increased markedly, and that had a couple of negative effects. So a lot of plants that were living in the estuary couldn't tolerate the really high levels of salt that were now coming in. And so between 1956 and today, 95% of the estuarine margin wetlands, including salt marsh, has died, and there's only a few remnants left. The other major change was when you speed water up on sand, it picks that sand up, right? And by removing the river from the back of the estuary, it meant 4 times as much water had to come in through the estuary mouth. And the only way it can come in on the same length of tide is to go faster. So it would pick that sand up on the way into the estuary and then dump it when it started to slow down again. So if you've been down to Maketu in the last couple of decades, you'll notice that there's a huge area of sand, which we call the flood tide delta, in front of the marae, in front of the township there. And that's been building up at the rate of about 13,000 cubic metres a year in response to that change, or mainly in response to that change at Te Tumu back in 1956. And so both of those things, so the loss of wetland vegetation around the estuary edges and the rapid infilling of the estuary with sand, have made the habitat less suitable for kaimoana and potentially also for fin fish.
What is the Kaituna Rediversion and Wetland Creation Project?
Yeah, so the project's goal is to bring as much fresh water and total volume of water from the Kaituna back into Maketu Estuary, maximising the ecological and cultural benefits by 2018, and doing so in a way that limits the adverse environmental effects and the financial costs to acceptable levels. So it's a bit of a big ask, and it's been on the cards for quite a long time. In 1984, 3,000 residents of Maketu signed a petition which the late MP Peter Tapsell took to Parliament, and Helen Clark was the Minister of Conservation in the 80s, and I think it was 1988 Cabinet directed the Department of Conservation to carry out a rediversion, so doing essentially what we're trying to do now. They applied for consent to bring back 14% of the river's flow to the estuary, but the consent that was granted was limited to 3.5% of the river's flow because the river was too dirty. So 24 years ago, the level of fecal coliforms in the lower Kaituna was running at an average of about 1,000 units per 100 mils, which is double the Ministry for the Environment's red alert level. And the thought was that if a significant proportion of that water was to be delivered into the estuary, it would become unsafe for fishing and potentially shellfish gathering and things like that. The good news on that is over the last 24 years, there's been a 5-fold reduction in fecal coliform levels in the lower river. So we're quite confident now that we can redivert a much larger proportion of the river's flow to the estuary without having those same concerns.
What are the two options that you're looking at?
Well, right behind me here, you can see a poster here. The two options are essentially the same at the upstream end. So we started from the principle that we should restore the channels as close as possible to what they were historically. The difficulty is that historically the river used to flow into the estuary very close to the sea, and if we redivert the water there, we're essentially drawing salt water in from the sea at Te Tumu and transferring that salt water back into the estuary, and we're not then reducing the salinity in the estuary. So we've moved the intake up to this location here, just west of what's called Ford Island, or potentially a little bit further upstream, and that means that we're getting a whole lot more fresh water and a whole lot less salt water coming through. We're then talking about replacing the 4 culverts under Ford Road with perhaps 30 or 40 culverts and lowering them as well. The differences in the options come out on the downstream side of Ford Road. The first option, option 1, creates a new channel heading northeast across the low-lying farmland there and makes the primary flow path quite close to the spit, quite close to the sea. The second option, option 2, is a widening of the existing Ford's cut, and that delivers most of the water into the southern part of the estuary instead.
A decision on what option to go ahead will be made next week. View boprc.gov.nz to find out more about the project. Stay tuned, as up next we learn more about biosecurity in the Bay of Plenty. If you've just joined us, welcome to Central News. July has been Biosecurity Month, and we've caught up with both regional councils to find out about specific threats to each region, and tonight is the last of our regional council biosecurity interviews with the Bay.
Moving on to animals, are there any pest animals that are a major problem in the Bay of Plenty?
From an exclusion eradication perspective, we only have 4 current pest animals. Most of them are either not currently in the region or extremely low densities. Koi carp, for example, has recently been eradicated from the region by Department of Conservation. So future issues will be around surveillance and ensuring that they are in fact removed, and with aquatic animals you never know where the next one's going to turn up. We have rooks, which is a crow-like bird. Their population is predominantly limited to the southern part of the region around Rangataiki. We have a small population, but there have been intermittent reports around Kitikiti and Rotorua for a number of years. But when you're dealing with highly mobile pests across a landscape, it's difficult sometimes to track them down.
Possums are a big problem everywhere in New Zealand, unfortunately. Are they particularly bad here?
In parts of the Bay of Plenty, they will be bad. It's classified as a restricted pest. Basically, they're widespread enough for us to be realistic about the fact that we can't feasibly control them within our current resources. We certainly encourage landowner efforts to control, and we will support them through approved programs. But also at the moment, with the price of fur, there's a lot of members of the public that are out there actively controlling possums themselves, because they can actually make significant amounts of money. The problem there, I guess, is they're never likely to get the levels low enough to have real biodiversity benefit or to make a real dent in the population. Possums are very adaptable. They can live in a bunch of habitats, and there's plenty of land out there where it is currently uncontrolled. So once you control one individual animal, then something's likely to move into that niche.
How does the council manage the possum situation then?
Through approved programs and landowner support. Similarly to the pest plant stuff, we have material available for sale through the regional council. If they make contact with us, we can help write approved programs if they're really keen on being proactive to control possums in their region. And there's also a number of people that would be jumping at the bit to get a block of land so they can actually get in there and do some control themselves and make a bit of money from fur.
Does the Bay of Plenty Regional Council use 1080?
1080 has been used in the Bay of Plenty. It hasn't been used a lot. Regional Council would support the use of 1080. We think it is a very effective tool. We understand that it's not particularly publicly acceptable, but research suggests that it is a good tool to use. But in saying that, we understand that there are many aspects of society that don't particularly agree with its use. Currently it would be at low levels and mainly from other organisations. We haven't actively used 1080 at Regional Council for a number of years.
What is an Argentine ant and why does it cause such a big problem?
So the Argentinian ant is an aggressive invasive species originally from South America. It was identified in the Auckland region in the 1990s and since then has spread throughout the majority of the North Islands. It's an aggressive species that can potentially displace other invertebrates. It has a nuisance factor because it tends to like living around human habitation, and it can also outcompete other pollinators such as bees. It's a restricted pest, so while we support landowner efforts, they're that widespread that it's unfeasible for us to control them.
So what does they actually look like?
They're just, you probably wouldn't be able to tell the difference if you saw it against a similar ant, except they're slightly larger. And they swarm, they tend to have a swarming mentality.
What should people do if they think that they have a bad pest animal problem in their backyard?
Yeah, by all means contact the Regional Council. We're happy to go out and meet on site with landowners, suggest adequate methods or efficient methods of control. We can help them put a management plan in place and suggest the methods that are going to help them get to their objectives at the end of the day.
Rabbits can be quite a big problem, especially down south and that kind of thing. Do we have a bad situation here?
Compared to some of the regions, I'd say no, but it is still a significant agricultural pest for a lot of people. So yes, we have a problem. Compared to other parts of the country, no, but it is still something that we do get a lot of public inquiries on. Luckily, rabbits, there's a lot that landowners can do to control them themselves, providing, I guess, that the densities aren't significant.
And how would you like landowners to manage their own rabbit situation?
Manual methods, basically, you can shoot, night shoot, but it's preferable if you're a skilled hunter because you can actually make them gun shy and spotlight shy. And there are a number of toxins available, something called mag toxin, where it's a fumigant that you put into the burrow. And there's a couple of other forms of toxins such as pindone and
if landowners do want to know more about identifying pests and what they should do with the resources available, what can they do?
Go onto our internet, there's plenty of information available there. We are currently updating it to make it more user-friendly and provide additional information for people. Come into the local council office, there are a number of fact sheets available that you can pick up while you're here, or just make contact with the council staff. Talk to the receptionist, tell them what your problem is, and they'll hopefully get you in contact with somebody who knows exactly what they're doing.
You can view any pest management information at boprc.gov.nz. That is the news for today. We really want you to be involved, so like us on Facebook and let us know your views. If you have any news, including your own video or photos, go to our website and hit upload. Thanks for joining us. I'll be back tomorrow night with more guests from in and around the region. I'm Amy Forrest. Have a lovely evening.
This has been an Alpha Media production, a division of Television Media Group.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.